Hello everyone, let us learn Python programming language. Literals. In this video, we will learn about some of the literals in Python. Keeping the beginners in mind, I will avoid using technical jargon. Literals or literal. Literal is a value that is clear, visible and raw. Literal is the actual data that we store somewhere. Remember, literal is always obvious and visible. Literal versus non-literal. You see a table which is divided into two parts. On the left side, it is in gray color. On the right side, it is in green color. On the left side, we have literals. Some of the literals that you can see are 31 is a literal value. 31 is obvious. 5.9 is a literal value. It is obvious. Naveen is a name that is obvious. True is a Boolean value that is obvious. The above values are clear, visible and raw. When it comes to non-literals, if you look at on the right side of the table, we see some of the non-literals like X. We don't know what X means. Interest rate. We don't know what is the interest rate by looking at the word or the compound words interest rate. We don't understand what does sales mean, or we don't understand what is the invoice amount. The above names or labels imply something that's not obvious. They are meant for something and we don't know what they are. So these are non-literals, whereas on the left side we have literals. There are different types of literals. First, let us look at integer literals. An integer is a value. Integer is a number without fractional part. That means integer numbers, they don't have decimal point. Integers are all positive values without fractional part, all negative values without fractional part, and 0. You can look at some of the examples. 3 is an integer, 85 is an integer, minus 100 is an integer, 0 is an integer, minus 99 is an integer, 17 is an integer. None of these numbers they have decimal point. There is no floating point, so they don't have fractional part. Any number without fractional part is called an integer. Now we are at Python console and we are going to understand integer literals now. Let me type some of the integer literals. I type 3. 3 is an integer. It's a literal value. And I am typing 3 at prompt. Now we already know 3 consecutive greater than symbols imply Python prompt. Now whatever we type at Python prompt is a command. I am giving 3 as an input at Python prompt, or 3 as a command. When it executes this 3, it returns 3 because 3 is a literal value. It cannot do anything with 3. It is a literal value. What we execute, that we get as an output. What we enter, that we get as an output. Let me do that with another number. 7. Now I gave 7 as an input. 7 is a literal number. It returned the same number as an output because there is nothing to do with 7. It's a literal value. 9. 0. Minus 85. Minus 77. All these are literals. In fact, integer literals. Whatever we executed, we got the same thing as an output. They are taken literally. They are not interpreted. They are not manipulated. They are literal values. Now let's come to float literals. A float or a floating point number is a value just like an integer. It is a number. Float is a number with fractional part. That means a floating point number has a decimal point, or you can call it as a number with decimal part or a floating point number. All positive values with fractional part are floating point numbers. All negative values with fractional part are floating point numbers. 0 with a decimal point is a floating point number. Let's look at some of the examples of floating point numbers. 3.0 is a floating point number because there is a fractional part. 85.13 is a floating point number because there is a fractional part. Minus 100.157 is a floating point number because there is a fractional part. 0.5 is a floating point number because there is a fractional point. Minus 99.1 is a floating point number because there is a fractional point or a decimal point. 0.0 is also a floating point number because there is a fractional part. Any number with a decimal point is a floating point number. Now let's look at some of the examples of floating point numbers. 0.0 is a floating point number. 8.5 is a floating point number. Minus 10.00982 is a floating point number. 13.01 is a floating point number. 18.112 is a floating point number. These are some of the examples of floating point numbers. They can be positive values, negative values, or a 0, but all the floating point numbers, they have fractional part. Now let's look at string literals. A string is similar to text. Some people also say string is a text. Yes, of course, string is text, but technically there is a difference. But for time being, we can assume string is a text. A string is characters strung together. A string is characters surrounded by quotation marks, either single or double quotation marks. Let's look at some of the examples. We can see 3 strings here. The first string is hello. It is surrounded by double quotation marks. Second string is Praveen. It is surrounded by single quotation mark. Third string is a number. It is surrounded by double quotation marks. So a string is always either surrounded by single quotation mark or double quotation marks, but make sure it is either surrounded by single quotation marks or double quotation marks, but don't start a string with single quotation mark and close it with a double quotation mark, or start it with a double quotation mark and close it with a single quotation mark. If you do that, we are using quotation marks inconsistently. And when you look at the third example, 1, 2, 3 is not a number, it is a string because it is surrounded by quotation marks. Now there is also something called empty string, a string without characters. If you just simply type quotation marks without anything in between, not even space, whether it is double quotation marks or single quotation marks, that's called an empty string. Now let's look at some of the string examples. Now what I do is I type a string and I surround it with single quotation marks. This is a string. I can also surround a string with double quotation marks. This is also a string, and it is a string literal. Okay, and if I don't surround it with any quotation marks, Python will assume that we are typing a Python command. So eventually it finds out there is no command by name thanks, so it returns an error. If you look at the error, name error, name thanks is not defined. It means there is no command by name thanks, so it returned an error. So always surround text with quotation marks, either with single quotation marks or double quotation marks, but use the quotation marks consistently. Now I start with single quotation mark and I want to end it with double quotation marks. Now we are using quotation marks inconsistently, so it throws an error. But let's say I start with double quotation mark and I end with single quotation mark. Even here we are using quotation marks inconsistently, so it throws an error. Boolean literals. A Boolean value is either true or false. True and false are Boolean literals. Boolean values in Python are in proper case. If you look at the word true and false, they are in proper case. That means the first letter of true is in uppercase and remaining letters are in lowercase. In the same way, the first letter of false is in uppercase and remaining letters are in lowercase. And remember, don't surround the Boolean values, that is true and false, by quotation marks. Otherwise, if you surround them with quotation marks, they become text strings. Now let's look at Boolean literals. I type true as a input, it returned true as a output. I type false as a input, it returned false as a output. But if I type a lowercase true, it returns an error, because that is not a Boolean value, and Python will assume that is a command, but there is no command by name true. Same thing with lowercase false. So true and false, when they are not surrounded by quotation marks, they are Boolean values. Apart from these literals, there are also other literals, and we are going to look at those literals in detail in the coming classes. Some of the literals are long literals, complex literals, they imply complex numbers, special literals like null, none, nan, Unicode literals. You can see U followed by quotation marks, and within the quotation marks we can type text. List literals, we have to surround items with brackets or square brackets. Tuple literals, we have to surround the items with parentheses. Dictionary literals, we have to surround them with braces. Set literals, we have to surround them with braces. And there are many types of literals. We'll be looking at each and every literal as we progress. Thanks for listening. Subscribe, share and like.